The Last Salute, Episode 1. Just a bus driver, until the emergency landing changed everything. He drove the same route every day for 15 years. Never late, never complained. Route 47 through downtown, past the hospital, past the school. Most passengers barely looked at him. Just another face behind the wheel, another uniform in the city machinery. They didn't notice the way his eyes constantly scanned the mirrors, the methodical pre-flight, pre-drive checks he performed each morning, or how his hands gripped the steering wheel with the precision of someone who had once controlled much more than city traffic. Welcome to The Last Salute. Before we begin this story of hidden courage and forgotten heroes, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve in silence. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Frank Morrison, 58, pulled his Metro City bus into the depot at 5:47 a.m., exactly 3 minutes early as always. His uniform was pressed, his badge polished, his logbook updated with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined his entire adult life. He walked around the bus, checking tire pressure, fluid levels, emergency exits, a routine most drivers rush through in 2 minutes. Frank took 8. The other drivers joked about it. "There goes Captain Frank," they'd say, watching him inspect every bolt and hinge, checking that bus like it's gonna fly away. They didn't know how close to the truth they were. His first passengers of the day were the regulars. Maria, the hospital nurse finishing her night shift. Tommy, the college student with headphones permanently attached to his ears. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who rode downtown to feed pigeons in the park. They nodded politely, dropped their fare, took their seats. Frank acknowledged each one with a quiet, "good morning," and the kind of calm presence that made people feel safe without quite knowing why. By 8:30 a.m., the bus was nearly full. The morning commute brought a mix of office workers, students, and service employees heading to their shifts. The conversations buzzed with the usual complaints: traffic, weather, Monday morning blues. Frank listened without commenting, his eyes moving between the road and his mirrors in a pattern that had become second nature over decades. That's when the first passenger noticed something was wrong. "Driver," called out Mr. Phillips, an accountant who rode Route 47 every weekday for 3 years. "Driver, there's something happening up ahead." Frank had already seen it. 2 miles ahead, a small private aircraft was descending too rapidly, trailing a thin line of black smoke. Most people would have assumed it was landing at the small municipal airport 5 miles west, but Frank knew better. The angle was wrong. The smoke was wrong. The trajectory was bringing it directly toward the highway. "Everyone stay calm," Frank announced, his voice steady and authoritative in a way none of his regular passengers had ever heard before. "I need everyone to move to the back of the bus, now." The change in his tone was immediate and unmistakable. This wasn't a request from a city employee. This was a command from someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Passengers began moving, some confused, others picking up on the urgency that had suddenly filled the air. Tommy pulled out his headphones. "What's going on, man?" "Just move back, son," Frank said, his hands adjusting something on the dashboard that most drivers never touched, the emergency communication system. "Stay low and hold on." Through the windshield, the aircraft was now clearly visible to everyone. A small Cessna, single engine, definitely in distress. Frank watched its approach with an expression that had gone from mild concern to intense calculation. His right hand moved to the bus radio with muscle memory that belonged to a different time, a different uniform. "Metro Control, "This is Bus 47, he called. "We have an aircraft in distress. Vector northeast, approaching Highway 9 at approximately." He paused, his eyes tracking the plane's descent with mathematical precision. 2,000 feet and dropping fast. "I'm stopping traffic." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, confused. "Bus 47, please repeat. Did you say aircraft?" "Confirmed. Emergency landing situation. I'm positioning to assist." Without waiting for a response, Frank activated the bus's emergency flashers and began a series of maneuvers that no city bus driver should have known how to execute. He angled the bus across 2 lanes, creating a barrier that forced other vehicles to slow and move away from the impact zone. Then he activated hazard signals most drivers didn't even know existed. Mrs. Henderson, now pressed against the back window with the other passengers, watched in amazement as their mild-mannered driver transformed into something else entirely. His movements were precise, confident, and completely focused. This wasn't panic. This was training. "Driver!" she called out, her voice shaking slightly. "Driver, how do you know what to do?" Frank didn't answer immediately. His attention was locked on the approaching aircraft, now less than a quarter-mile away and clearly heading for the stretch of highway just ahead of them. The pilot was good, Frank could see that much. Whoever was flying that plane was fighting to control it, trying to use the straight section of highway as an emergency runway. "Because," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying to the back of the bus, "I've been where he is." The Cessna touched down hard about 200 yards ahead, bouncing once before settling onto the asphalt with a screech of tires and the grinding sound of metal against pavement. Frank was already moving, grabbing the bus's fire extinguisher and first aid kit before the plane had even come to a complete stop. "Stay on the bus!" he commanded, and again that voice brooked no argument. "Do not get off for any reason!" What happened next would be talked about in Metro City for months. Frank Morrison ran toward the smoking aircraft with the confidence of someone who had done this before, not as a bus driver, but as someone else entirely. He reached the plane just as the pilot was struggling to open the jammed door, smoke beginning to pour more heavily from the engine compartment. The pilot was conscious, but clearly injured, blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. Frank assessed the situation in seconds. The door was bent from the impact, the engine was overheating, and fuel was beginning to leak onto the hot asphalt. "Can you move?" Frank asked, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. I think so," the pilot managed. "Can't get the door." Frank examined the door mechanism with hands that knew aircraft construction intimately. He found the emergency release most people would never locate and had the door open in 10 seconds. "Easy now," Frank said, helping the pilot out of the cockpit with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed emergency extractions before. "What's your name?" Dave Torres. I'm a flight instructor from Riverside Aviation." "Okay, Dave. I'm Frank. You did good getting her down on the highway. Real good." As Frank helped Dave away from the aircraft, using techniques he had learned in a different life, Dave looked up at him with confusion. You know planes?" Frank's response was quiet, almost lost in the sound of approaching sirens. "Used to." By the time the emergency vehicles arrived, Frank had administered first aid to Dave's head wound, used the bus's fire extinguisher to prevent the fuel leak from igniting, and had somehow managed to direct traffic around the scene using hand signals that seemed more military than civilian. The paramedics took over Dave's care, and the fire department secured the aircraft. Police officers began their investigation, and a crowd had gathered to watch the spectacle. But through it all, Frank remained in the background, deflecting questions and trying to return to his bus. That's when Dave Torres called out to him. "Wait," Dave said from the stretcher as the paramedics prepared to load him into the ambulance. "I don't understand. How did you know How did you know exactly what to do? Frank paused at the door of his bus, his hand on the handle. For a moment, he looked like he might just climb in and drive away without answering. Then he turned back to Dave, and for the first time that morning, his carefully maintained civilian facade cracked just slightly. 32 years, Frank said. United States Air Force, fighter pilot, then cargo, then instructor pilot. Retired as a colonel in 2009. The crowd that had gathered fell silent. The police officers stopped writing their reports. Even the paramedics paused. Dave Torres, despite his injuries, managed to sit up slightly on the stretcher. Colonel, what did you fly? Frank looked uncomfortable with the attention, but Dave deserved an answer. F-16s mostly, some cargo work later, C-130s, C-17s. He paused, then added quietly, 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. One of the police officers, a young man who couldn't have been older than 25, stepped forward. Sir, I had no idea. Why didn't you say anything when we arrived? Frank shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both humble and dignified. Because I'm a bus driver now. That's my job. But Dave Torres wasn't finished. Despite his pain and the shock of the emergency landing, he was staring at Frank with something approaching awe. Wait, Frank Morrison? Colonel Frank Morrison? Frank's expression changed slightly, becoming more guarded. You know that name? Know it, Dave laughed, then winced as the movement aggravated his injuries. Every flight instructor in the Air Force knows that name. You wrote half the emergency procedures manual we still use. And you, Dave paused, his voice dropping with respect, you're the pilot who landed the damaged C-130 in Kandahar, saved 37 Marines. The silence that followed was profound. Frank Morrison, bus driver for Route 47, looked deeply uncomfortable with the recognition. He cleared his throat and took a step toward his bus. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Not that long, Dave replied. And those Marines? They had families, children. You brought them home. One of the passengers from Frank's bus, Tommy, the college student, had gotten off despite instructions and had heard the entire conversation. He looked at Frank with new eyes, suddenly understanding why their bus driver always seemed so calm, so prepared, so different from Mr. Morrison, Tommy said, his voice uncertain. Why are you driving a bus? Frank looked at the young man for a long moment before answering. Because someone has to, and because, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Because taking care of people doesn't stop when you take off the uniform. Mrs. Henderson, who had also disobeyed instructions and joined the crowd, stepped forward. All these years, she said, her voice full of wonder. All these years you've been driving us to work, to school, to the hospital, and we never knew. You weren't supposed to know, Frank replied. That's the point. The fire chief, a veteran himself, approached Frank with obvious respect. Colonel, if you ever want to volunteer with our emergency response team. Frank shook his head politely but firmly. I appreciate the offer, Chief, but I have a route to finish. People depending on me to get them where they need to go. As the crowd began to disperse and the emergency crews finished their work, Frank prepared to return to his bus. The aircraft had been cleared from the highway, traffic was beginning to flow normally again, and his passengers were ready to continue their journey. But something had changed forever. As Frank performed his post-incident safety check and prepared to resume Route 47, his passengers looked at him differently. The quiet man behind the wheel wasn't just their driver anymore. He was someone who had served his country with distinction, who had saved lives at 30,000 feet and on battlefields halfway around the world, and who had chosen to continue serving in the most humble way possible. Maria, the night shift nurse, was the first to speak as Frank pulled the bus back into traffic. "Colonel Morrison," she said, using his rank for the first time, "thank you for everything." Frank met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Just Frank, please. And thank you for trusting me to get you home safely." Tommy, still processing what he had witnessed, asked the question everyone was thinking. "Why didn't you ever tell us? About your service, I mean." Frank was quiet for a moment, navigating through the lingering traffic from the incident. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had thought deeply about this question. "Because," he said, "real service isn't about getting credit. It's about doing what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, whether anyone notices or not. I spent 32 years in the Air Force, and I was honored to serve. But that service didn't end when I retired. It just changed form." Mrs. Henderson wiped away a tear she didn't realize had formed. "You've been taking care of us all this time." "That's the job," Frank replied simply. "Getting people home safely. Whether it's in a C-130 or a city bus, the mission is the same." For the rest of that day, and in the days that followed, Route 47 was different. Passengers still rode to their destinations, still caught up on sleep or scrolled through their phones. But they also did something they had never done before. They really looked at the man driving their bus. They noticed the way he checked his mirrors, not casually, but with the systematic precision of someone trained to be responsible for lives. They saw how he helped elderly passengers with their bags, how he waited an extra moment for people running to catch the bus, how he somehow always knew the fastest route around traffic jams. Word spread throughout the Metro City transit system. Other drivers heard the story and began looking at Frank differently too. The man they had jokingly called Captain Frank really had been a captain, and much more. But Frank Morrison continued to deflect the attention. When reporters tried to interview him, he politely declined. When the city wanted to give him a commendation, he suggested they donate to a veterans charity instead. When fellow veterans sought him out to share stories, he listened respectfully, but rarely shared his own. 3 weeks after the incident, Dave Torres returned to Frank's bus. His head wound had healed, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of that dramatic morning. He had been cleared to fly again, but before returning to the cockpit, he had one more thing to do. "Colonel Morrison," Dave said as he boarded the bus during the morning rush. "Just Frank," came the familiar reply. "Frank," Dave continued, "I wanted you to know, I've been flying for 15 years, and what you did that day, the way you positioned your bus, the way you handled the aftermath, that was some of the finest emergency response I've ever seen." Frank accepted the compliment with a simple nod. "You did the hard part. Getting that plane down safely on a highway isn't something they teach in bus driving school." Dave laughed. "I don't think they teach what you did in bus driving school either." He paused, then added more seriously, "I also wanted you to know, I looked up that Kandahar incident. 37 Marines wasn't the whole story, was it?" Frank's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but his voice remained steady. "Stories get exaggerated over time."
The plane was hit by enemy fire, both engines failing, landing gear damaged, and you brought it down in a sandstorm with zero visibility.
The bus had grown quiet. Even passengers who hadn't heard the beginning of the conversation were listening now. "We all did our jobs that day," Frank said simply.
"And one of those Marines you brought home,"
Dave continued,
"was my brother."
The silence that followed was profound. Frank looked up, meeting Dave's eyes in the rearview mirror.
"Staff Sergeant David Torres,"
Dave said.
He always said the pilot who saved them was a legend, someone who made the impossible look routine.
Dave's voice grew thick with emotion.
He died 2 years later, IED outside Fallujah, but he got to come home first. Got to meet his daughter, got to hold her because of you.
Frank pulled the bus over to the curb and engaged the parking brake. For a moment, he just sat there, his head bowed slightly.
What was her name? Frank asked quietly. Your brother's daughter. Hope, Dave replied. Her name is Hope. She's 8 now.
Frank turned around in his seat to face Dave directly. Tell Hope that her father was a hero. Tell her that he served with honor and that he saved lives just like his father saves lives. Different uniform, same mission. As Dave prepared to get off the bus, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and metallic. It was a set of pilot's wings. Not the kind you buy in a gift shop, but the real ones, worn and weathered.
These belong to my brother,
Dave said.
He always said he'd give them to the pilot who brought him home, if he ever got the chance.
He placed them gently on the dashboard in front of Frank.
He'd want you to have them.
Frank stared at the wings for a long moment, then looked back at Dave.
I can't accept these. You already earned them.
Dave replied.
32 years ago and 3 weeks ago and every day since, when you've made sure people get home safely.
After Dave left, Frank sat in his parked bus for several minutes, looking at the wings on his dashboard. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke from her usual seat near the front.
Are you going to keep them there?
Frank picked up the wings, examined them carefully, then placed them in his shirt pocket, over his heart. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I will. Route 47 resumed its journey through Metro City, carrying passengers to their destinations as it had thousands of times before. But something fundamental had changed. The quiet man behind the wheel was no longer invisible. His service, both past and present, had been recognized, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the simple acknowledgement that real heroes often hide in plain sight. Frank Morrison continued to drive his route every day, still arriving early, still checking every detail, still treating each passenger with the same quiet respect he had always shown. But now, when people looked at him, they saw more than just a bus driver. They saw a reminder that service comes in many forms, that heroism doesn't always wear a uniform, and that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that happen quietly, day after day, carrying people safely through their ordinary lives. And every morning, as Frank performed his pre-trip inspection of Bus 47, he would touch the wings in his pocket, a small reminder that some missions never really end. They just find new ways to continue. The last salute isn't always given with hands raised in military precision. Sometimes it's given with steady hands on a steering wheel, getting people home safely, 1 mile at a time. Have you ever met someone whose quiet service hid a remarkable past? Someone who continued their mission long after taking off the uniform? Share their story in the comments below, and let's honor those who serve in silence. Thank you for watching The Last Salute. If this story moved you, subscribe to help us share more stories of hidden heroes and quiet courage. Until next time, remember, heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just show up, do their job, and make sure everyone gets home safely.